I'm Liz Hamson and I'm editor of Property Week, and I'm delighted to be joined by Roger Wade, the founder of Boxpark. Now, last year, Roger took part in a Property Week event debating how to survive the retail apocalypse. Today, as part of our View from the Top series, we're here to discuss what, incredibly, could be an even bleaker outlook for the sector in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, or parts of the sector anyway. The reopening of non-essential shops prompted near riots as all the pent-up demand was released suddenly and shoppers stormed the likes of the Nike store on Oxford Street, TK Maxx and Primark. Social distancing measures seemingly a thing of the past. However, with the full reopening of pubs, bars, cafes and restaurants not expected until next month, it was small comfort to the hospitality sector. While Boxpark is gearing up to reopen on the 4th of July, Roger believes the retail and hospitality sectors still face Armageddon if landlords, tenants and government don't work together to address the crisis right now. Roger, thanks for joining us. Now, Armageddon is a pretty strong word. Why, given all the measures that have been put in place to prevent that happening, do you think the outlook is still potentially so bleak?
I mean, you're right, Armageddon is a strong word, but if it makes our industry sort of stand up and realise the crisis is about to face, then it's the right word, because undoubtedly on the current path that we're on a path for a collision course. I mean, you've got a situation that many operators are blaming landlords for the current existing problems. I think some of that is being fueled by things like hospitality union and asking for 100% rent reduction. You've got landlords creating things like the landlords union, and they're hitting back and they're effectively asking the government for 100% rent cover and saying, look, why has there not been any help for rent during this period? And unless something gives, we're going to be facing a major crisis. I mean, the reality is at the end of this month, the rent enforcement moratorium ends. Hopefully it will be continued.
Do you think it will be continued?
I think it has to be continued, because if it's not continued, it basically needs to continue for the period until we find a framework to resolve the current rent crisis. I don't think it's good for the future of our industry, and it's certainly something that's only a stopgap measure, and it's certainly something that we shouldn't have going forward. But until we find a solution, I think having a bit of cooling off period to try and find a solution is important, but we need to time limit it. I mean, the reality is, as I was saying, at the end of June, technically in a few weeks time, there's going to be up to 6 months outstanding rent. And I think that you could have up to 50% of retail and hospitality businesses that won't survive lockdown.
Do you really think it's that high? Because, I've been hearing figures of a third, and I think that's what they were talking about, for example, in Soho. And I thought that was a stark enough statistic. You're saying 50%?
I think it could be up to 50%. I think the reality is no one really knows. But if you really understand the issue, you can totally understand that there could be up to 50% of retail hospitality businesses closing down. And as a result of that, I think you could see up to 3.5 million job losses. I mean, just recently they announced the biggest downturn in GDP ever recorded. And a quarter of that was down to the fact that hospitality was not opened. So we can't play down the significance of the hospitality industry, never mind the retail industry. So yes, when I use the word Armageddon, I'm not using it lightly. We're certainly on the course for a collision, and that doesn't help anyone. Landlords will lose out, operators will lose out, government will lose out, and ultimately there will be no bounce back. And we've got to realise that we're all in this boat together. And unless we actually all swim together, we'll all sink together. So we need to come together and find a common solution.
And do you feel that at the moment people are very much not sort of swimming together, and that it's become a more divisive issue? Or do you see any sort of positive signs of genuine collaboration going on, at least between, say, landlords and tenants?
I mean, there's been some token gestures in terms of, the code of conduct. And I'm not saying that all landlords and all tenants are not trying to find a solution, but the reality is we need to find a framework. That's the issue. We need to find a framework and a way of operating that we can apply across the entire industry, because it's the impact of the collision course that we're perhaps going to be going on is going to have an impact in every single sector, not just operators.
So tell me a little bit more about what you would like this framework to look like. What do you think needs to happen, and why?
Okay, I mean, it's quite. Boxpark is in quite a unique position because we're a tenant to major institutional landlords like Schroders, Hamsons, and Quintain. We're a landlord to over 100 small businesses that are our street food and retailers at Boxpark, and we're also operator. Our principal business is running bars and events, so we're maybe in a unique position because we're seeing it from all sides. And I'm a member of Revo, I'm a member of UK Hospitality, and I think the perspective that we've got is if we exclude material costs, because obviously during the period of lockdown, we haven't had to produce any food, we haven't had to deliver any drinks. There's three major cost centres in our business, which is salary, rates and rent. Now, the government have done a fantastic scheme in terms of being very generous with the salary furlough scheme. So we've largely dealt with the issue of salary. They've been generous as well in terms of business rates and effectively giving a business rates allowance for up to 12 months. But we haven't addressed the issue of rent. And the way I equate that, it's like the Monty Python sketch, isn't it? Where the knight gets his two arms chopped off. You know what? I've got both my arms chopped off. One arm has been sewn back on, which is the salary furlough scheme and the rate. But you know what? I'm going to bleed to death from the other arm, which is my rent. And unless we address the issue of rent, we're not going to resolve it. So, and I don't think it's fair to say that actually the resolution to that is bounce back loans or CBIL loans, because effectively that puts all the liability onto the operator, and it's going to incur a major debt, and actually it won't be able to repay those debts, and it's going to kick the problem down the line. So I think the resolution on it needs to be that we find a rent solution, and I think there is a sensible rent solution, because the alternative to that is what we're beginning to see at the moment, which is, and it's the tip of the iceberg, the CVAs and administrations that are going on, because it's going to be easier to go into administration, it's going to be easier to have CVAs than to actually pay the rent.
Sorry, you're an advocate of turnover-based rents and switching to that model.
The first thing that I'm an advocate of is like, let's forget about long-term measures and turnover rents. Undoubtedly, we've got to resolve issues like turnover rents, we've got to resolve issues of business rates. But first and foremost, we've got to perform triage. We've just got to make sure that the businesses that we've got survive. So we need time. So what we're saying at the moment is, look, government didn't create this problem, landlords didn't create this top problem, and certainly operators didn't create this problem. So let's adopt an attitude of shared pain. Let's all work together to resolve the issue, okay? It's not going to be landlords give 100% rent reduction. That's not fair. It's not going to be landlords expecting to make profit and get 100% rent contribution from the government. Come on, I think we both all realise, I don't think there's any sensible professional in the room that believes that either one of those polar positions are fair.
What's the compromise measure? Where's the sort of halfway house that's going to suit everybody, do you think?
So, I've been working quite closely with UK Hospitality, and I know that Revo, Vivian King, has her own scheme which is similar to the UK Hospitality scheme, and I think the scheme that they proposed is a space furlough scheme which has been based upon a model that's been adopted in Denmark. And how that scheme would work is that potentially landlords would give 50% rent reduction up to a period of 9 months, okay, effectively cover the majority of its costs. Government would pay a 25% grant directly to landlords, and I think it's important to stress that. I think that operators have had quite a lot of help, but there's been no help for landlords, and I think it's totally understandable that any government help goes directly to the landlords, and then tenants would be responsible for paying the balance of 25%. My understanding is UK Hospitality, Revo, the British Retail Confederation, the British Property Federation all met yesterday, and they talked about the space furlough scheme. My understanding is nothing is being resolved, and it's time now.
So what's the sticking point then? Well, why hasn't it been resolved?
I don't understand the sticking point. Everyone has to make a fair compromise. And maybe if the fair compromise was even a third, that the landlords reduced the rent by a third, the government gave a third towards a grant, and the operator was responsible for a third, even that might be acceptable. But we've got to get to a sensible solution, because if not, it's going to come down like a house of cards. You're going to get increasing amount of administrations and CVAs. Landlords are going to get in trouble. There's already talk about a major retail development company that's maybe going to be bankrupt within the next week or two. It's going to come down like a house of cards.
But it seems as though the whole situation is becoming more divisive than ever. And I do wonder whether this compromise is possible. You're talking about these sticking points, you don't understand what they are. Isn't the sticking point is that everybody is in a battle for survival here, and they don't want to give anything at this stage because they don't think they can afford to give anything. They've got to sort of stand their ground and get as much out of the situation as possible.
I'm in the same battle for survival. I'm a tenant, I'm a landlord, and I'm an operator. And from my perspective, the only way forward is by all cooperating together and understanding each one of our issues and finding a solution. And if we don't find a solution, the repercussions of that are just too great to consider. And we need to find the solution. And we need to wake up now, and we need to find a solution soon.
On the plus side, it seems as though there is an acknowledgement something needs to give, and there is a desire to at least get round the table and talk about issues. Rent is clearly one of the big sticking points. You've mentioned before that various parties are working together. We know that they're working on a code of practice at the moment to encourage so-called fair and transparent discussions over rental payments. But I have to say that the code is described by the likes of Nick Leslaw as toothless. Those gaming the system, as so many will this quarter day, will not pick up a copy of the code, let alone read it, he says damningly in this week's Property Week. You disagree? Why?
I don't disagree.
Oh, you think you're not right so you think it's toothless?
I agree about one thing, which is I feel, of course, the code of conduct is toothless because it doesn't force either party to actually stick to anything. So I totally understand Nick's points that, it's not going to resolve anything. But on the contrary to that, it brings the parties together and actually says, look, you need to sit around the table and resolve it. So I totally understand what Nick is saying, that at the moment, that's not going to resolve it. It isn't going to resolve. It's not going to resolve anything. But actually, just the beginning of the talks is something good. The reality is the idea that we create individual negotiations and we leave individual landlords and individual tenants to resolve these issues is just not workable. And it's also grossly unfair. I mean, if you take the situation of Boxpark on the minute of the government announcing the lockdown, it gave free rent and service charge during the whole entire period of the lockdown. We were an exception at that time. I think some other large parties, I think most notably people like Argent also gave something similar, okay? But actually, there was no encouragement for us to do that. So from my perspective, it doesn't seem fair that you've got some landlords trying to help out. You've got other landlords at an extreme threatening to close down businesses. So I think we actually need a framework set up, and that framework needs to be set up by the government. It is not fair for the government to introduce a lockdown. Yes, of course, that's about public safety, but then to pick up the bill for the lockdown should be down to operators and landlords. No, the lockdown was instigated by the government, and the government needs to help out. And actually, if the whole reason it's done a salary furlough scheme is for a bounce back, you're not going to have any bounce back, because guess what? My arm's still cut off. I'm going to bleed to death.
The government is trying to do something, though, isn't it, with the launch of the High Streets Task Force, which is chaired by Elandi boss and former Revo president Mark Robinson. And it's also launched this £50 million Reopening High Streets Safely Fund. What role do you see that new task force and fund playing?
I mean, firstly, you're talking about putting a bit of a band-aid on my arm being chopped off. I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. 50 million's not going to do anything. So it's just really all superficial. So that's not going to resolve the issue. And, you know, I sat in on a VC call with the Secretary of State for Business, Alex Sharma, last week, and you know, and they were talking about how do we encourage economic growth. And you know, I was asked to comment, and I went, guys, you don't get it. This is not a time to talk about economic growth. This is a time when we're talking about survival. That's what we're talking. You can't have any growth if you haven't got any businesses that are left. You know, we've got to talk about survival. So you know, that's the key issue at the moment. And, you know, I know Mark Robinson really well. I'm sure he's going to do a great job in that role. He's obviously got the knowledge in terms of working with Revo as its former president. You know, what the things that I would like to see is obviously there is going to need to be a lot of help for regenerating our high streets. You know, the reality is that the current business rate mechanism is archaic. It was invented at a time before internet, and it's not fit for purpose. We need to create a level playing field with the internet. You cannot have, you know, if we see what's happened during COVID-19, I'm in Brighton Lanes at the moment, you know, and during the period of lockdown, it was like a ghost town. The reality is our shops, our hotels, our leisure, our pubs, they're the heart and soul of our communities. And if we want to create ghost towns up and down our country, then you know what? Do nothing about our high streets.
You're really frustrated, aren't you, about the sort of level of government intervention and the nature of it. You've mentioned some things that it can do there to do more to support the industry. What else should it be doing then? What kind of tax breaks can it offer people? What else should it be doing that it isn't currently doing? And you know, what impact would you hope to see that have?
Liz, I'm not here to sort out the government's problem. I'm just quite a simple folk. There's one area that I really understand, which is I understand retail and I understand hospitality, and I understand the needs of our tenants at the moment. So I'm speaking on behalf of the 100+ small tenants that we've got at Boxpark. And in order for those businesses to survive, there's 3 fundamental things that we need. The safe distancing to go down from 2 meters to 1 meter as per WHO suggestions and as adopted by other major countries. We need to get our hospitality and leisure businesses back up and running on the 4th of July as per a lot of other European countries. And finally, we need to have a holistic approach and resolve the issue of rent. You cannot just do something on salary but not do anything on rent. As for what else the government does, I don't really care. I really don't. I only care about the survival of our industry at the moment, buying it some time. Let's survive. Let me live another day. Please sew my arm back on.
You talked about this, and you don't like the word social distancing, safe distancing, and what it would mean if it was reduced from 2 meters to 1 meter. What impact do you think that would have if on July the 4th that was the measure that was allowed and the government changed its stance? Because it's currently reviewing that metric at the moment.
I mean, we've got to get round the fact that, you know, COVID-19 is not a problem that is specific to the UK. It's a global problem. And why are we not adopting some policies that have been followed in other countries? You know, we don't have to get nationalistic about COVID-19. Why don't we just be sensible and look at the case studies of other nations and what they've done? So the reality is it's not economical to open up hospitality businesses and leisure businesses with 2 meter social distancing. It's not a reduction by 50% of your capacity. It's a reduction, a 4-fold reduction. You can get 4 people in a 2 meter square size based on 1 meter social distancing as opposed to 1 meter with 2 meter social distancing. So for everyone to understand that's how dramatic it is. It's a difference between a 100-seat restaurant getting in 25 people or 50 people or 12 and a half if you could get 12 and a half people. It's that dramatic. Forget the polls. Do the right thing.
You mentioned earlier, going back to this moratorium that's being given to landlords, and that it obviously expires quite soon. What impact would that have if that moratorium was extended?
I'll be frank with you. I think that's a last case scenario, because I don't really believe in it's the fundamental building block of our whole infrastructure. Everyone's got to realise we're all reliant on each other. Actually, operators need strong landlords. Landlords need strong operators. Government need us both to pay our taxes. And actually taking away the very fabric that binds us together, the lease, and actually saying the lease is worth nothing and having a rent enforcement moratorium, it's a cop-out. What we should be doing is taking decisive action to address the issue of rent. We could save money by offering a space furlough scheme to operators as opposed to extending the current salary furlough scheme beyond the end of August. Maybe give the operators a choice. I'm part of a WhatsApp group which has got most of the major hospitality and leisure operators, the CEOs in there. And the 3 things that we want at this moment in time is we want to reduce safe distancing to 1 meter, we want to open on the 4th of July, and we want rent support. That is our key request.
In the meantime, we've talked about August, and what about next week? And we've got rent quarter day next week. What does that hold for you? What do you think is going to happen there?
Probably the single number one concern that I've got in the business. The reality is that, we haven't charged rent for the last quarter. We've been deliberately had a very soft touch with operators. There's some operators that we've got that owe us money from the previous quarter while they were trading, but we've adopted a deliberate soft touch because it's a difficult situation. But the reality is that we're like other businesses. We've got to make sure we're managing our P&L.
And how has that gone down with them? How have they responded to that? Have they sort of been very receptive? Have they been saying, yeah, this is good, we like what you're doing? Or have they been asking for other measures to be introduced by you?
I don't think you're going to get any tenant complaining about a landlord not charging a rent and service charge.
But a lot of them want more than that at the moment. So
they do, and a lot of it is getting fueled by some of the rhetoric that's out there at the moment in terms of it's landlords that have been creating this XYZ. Hopefully they'll watch this and they'll see other things that I've done and see that I'm trying to broker a solution for the entire industry.
Yeah, I think what you're saying all makes perfect sense. Let's fast forward to the 4th of July when you're reopening. What's Boxpark going to look like in your various locations on that day when it reopens?
It's weird because on day one, when we first went into this, we had a best case and worst case operational model. I'm speaking purely operational now as a bar and events operator. And our worst case model was no income for 12 months. And our best case model was that for Q2 we get no income. Yeah, we got no income. Q3 25%, Q4 50%, Q1 next year 75%, and getting like for likes back for Q2 next year. Our best case scenario has now become our worst case scenario. So we're expecting at least say 50% of our footfall back into our sites. Clearly some sites like Wembley are going to be more challenged because they're heavily reliant on the stadium and the arena. Okay. There is going to be a period that obviously we can't put large events on, but we do a lot of small events. So we anticipate that the customer is going to come back. We've just seen the shops open 24 hours ago and the shops have been busy. I'm not saying they've been busy to the levels that they've been built before, but the reality is the customer wants to come back. I'm very optimistic about the future, Personally, from a business perspective, we're also looking to grow post coronavirus, because I think there will be some fallout, and we're hoping there'll be some site opportunities out there. And we're already talking to lots of potential landlords about new sites. So we are optimistic.
Tell us where you're looking.
Nothing's been specific, but
What about Croydon as well? What are the plans there? Because you've been there for 5 years now, haven't you?
yeah, so, I was actually just speaking to Schroders just before this, and we're talking to Schroders, for instance, about other sites and talking about extending our lease within Croydon. So, we are dedicated to making sure that we stay within Croydon. We think the community of Croydon is fantastic. They've really backed us. I know your business is based in Croydon, Liz, so don't worry, we're not going anywhere.
What does this mean for the high street? Has shopper behaviour changed permanently? What about the physical store? Does that have a viable future, or are we really going to see the beginning of the end start to happen for the physical store and everything go to a sort of showrooming concept, physical store with pretty much everything else being done online?
I mean, Liz, great question. I mean, I'm a great believer in the physical store. So my own prediction is, in the long term, customer behavior will not change. That the customer loves the feeling of community. It loves going into stores, and I don't believe that's going to ever change. Retail's about content, traffic, and conversion. I think there used to be a famous fund manager out there called Paul Templeton. And when everyone zigged, he zagged. When everyone did invest in Japan, he invested in Japan. When everyone did invest in corporations in America post-depression, he invested in them. So for all those investors out there, get your checkbooks out. Retail property is actually undervalued. It's time to go into it.
I mean, you talked about your own sort of personal experience and background there. What have you taken away from this whole crisis? What have been the big lessons that you've learned from COVID-19? What would you do differently in the future, do you think?
For me, it's shown me that I've appreciated what I've got. I've spent too much of my entrepreneurial career chasing things, and it's almost been like a dance move. I've forgotten that the dance moves are more important than getting from across that dance floor as quick as possible. Life is about the moves in between.
Listen, thanks ever so much, Roger. I think that was really insightful, and you've argued your case really cogently there. Let's hope that landlords, tenants and government do now start to pull together to avoid Armageddon, and that better times lie ahead for Boxpark and the High Street.
Thank you, Liz.